Welcome again to the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. We're returning tonight to an important theme, the risks posed by nuclear proliferation and Australia's role in negotiations to secure an enduring agreement on disarmament. Previous speakers we've had have told us about the prospects for convergence between the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called Ban Treaty. Our speaker today will update us on the status of these agreements and what they mean for international peace and security. John Tillerman is exceptionally well qualified to unpack these complex issues. In 2008, he was appointed director of the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, co-chaired by former Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans with Japan. In 87-90, he served as Australia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. As Chief of Staff to no fewer than two IAEA Directors General, Hans Blix and Mohammed El-Baradei, John handled such thorny issues as the nuclear weapons programs of Iraq, North Korea, and South Africa. And John's also represented Australia at the NPT and Australia Group meetings on chemical and biological weapons control. And since leaving DFAT in 2016, John has been associated with the Asia-Pacific Network, Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, where he is currently a Senior Associate Fellow. So on the housekeeping, following John's talk, we will take questions from both our in-house audience and our online participants via the Q&A function on Zoom. We will aim to answer as many questions as we can and finish promptly at 7 p.m. So, without any further ado, over to John for your remarks.
Many thanks, Heath, and very nice to be back here again in the speaking chair rather than in the audience. Indeed. But nice to see so many friends and in the audience. I guess in the light of the events of the last 24 hours, I was surprised we didn't get a call on council tonight because Biden and Putin have fixed the world. They're going to sort out nuclear problems. So we could, perhaps have the night off. But I guess it's not going to be that easy anyway, but we'll come back to that further in my remarks. What I'd like to do this evening is to start with some broad brush outline of the nuclear era, its history and its current characteristics. Then go on, as you say, to talk about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, some comment on the Prohibition Treaty, and then with some thoughts on the future. So the nuclear community, but first to the context, the nuclear community likes to refer to three nuclear ages. The first nuclear age starting 75 years ago with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was marked by the core confrontation between the Warsaw Pact and NATO. It was a sort of the time of the Dr. Strange-Lovian mutually assured destruction, the prime doctrine driving strategic positions. The Cuban Missile Crisis, just 60 years ago, did give a bit of a jolt to all of that situation and did make the leaders of the Western world and the Soviet Union start on the path of some arms control. Led to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and, importantly, to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The second nuclear age really started with the collapse of the Soviet Empire in, say, 1990, and it was marked by increasing number of nuclear players. That was the first point, and a shift in the focus from the Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific. Not that the Atlantic went away, but the Asia-Pacific grew in importance and arguably grew more in terms of the complexity of the nuclear standoffs. There were some good advances in nuclear arms control during that period, but of course, in the last 5-10 years, increased tensions between Moscow and Washington have brought the second nuclear age to a rather tricky end. We're now said to be entering the third nuclear age, marked by modernization and new interacting zones of conflict such as space and cyber warfare. And there's new generations of strategic non-nuclear weapons. The expectation is that nuclear risks are more likely to grow than recede. So how does the world look at the end of the second age and the beginning of the third nuclear age? Perhaps the most obvious point to make is that the other existential threats to global security, climate change and pandemics, are clearly taking global attention away from the nuclear threats. But to my mind, nuclear weapons remain the greatest and certainly the most immediate existential threat. Russia and the US between them hold a huge arsenal, some 12,000 warheads, of which 3,000 are actively deployed. And in our region, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea are growing their weapons stocks and enhancing their capacities to deliver them. While the Atlantic theater has the majority of weapons, the Asia-Pacific has emerged as the new global epicenter of nuclear risks. And the Asia-Pacific, I would put it, is more complex and less understood than the bilateral, rather simple confrontation between Moscow and Washington. It's never exactly simple, but if you compare it with the complexity of the Asia-Pacific, then I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw. We have in our region 6 nuclear-armed states engaged in a complex chain of nuclear-tipped relations, and with others in alliance relations which offer nuclear protection. And there's an arc of geopolitical hotspots, nuclear hotspots, ranging from Northeast Asia, Korean Peninsula, through the South China Sea, across to the Himalayas, and then to the Indus Valley, where India and Pakistan stand off. Error or accident could have a catastrophic consequence. North Korea's nuclear ambitions pose a particular challenge. And let's not forget that South Korea, Japan, and for that matter, Taiwan, have sophisticated nuclear industrial bases with relatively short lead time to weapons capabilities. While they remain committed to their verified NPT undertakings, these 2 countries and Taiwan still have voices frequently raising the questions of whether the US alliance can be trusted and whether they should have an indigenous capability. And lo and behold, even those questions are raised in Australia. May recall recent discussions with Professor Hugh White and Paul Dibb. One last point. Over the decades of the Cold War, the Atlantic theater developed a set of regional mechanisms for building confidence and attempting to manage conflict. Asia-Pacific mechanisms do exist, but they're still very much a work in progress. And to date, they have not been able to address nuclear issues. So that is the regional nuclear context, and it is all against a backdrop of increasing regional strategic competition, marked by power adjustments and increased insecurities. Let me now turn to the NPT, its origins and evolution. To my mind, the NPT is the most successful global mechanism ever for containing nuclear threats, and arguably has contributed more to human security than any other single instrument. The 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis stung Washington and Moscow into an awareness that efforts needed to be made to contain nuclear threats. There was a US intelligence assessment in 1963, which predicted that some 15 to 25 states could, in relatively short time, acquire nuclear weapons. In Asia-Pacific, the list included China, India, Japan, and yes, Australia. The text of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, was largely the work of the United States and Russia, and it was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1968. The treaty entered into force in 1970. Though adopted by 95 votes for and 4 against with some 20 abstentions, many countries nevertheless were still very unhappy with one element or another of the deal. And I underline this because today many argue that the NPT is in dire straits because so many countries are very critical of it, even if they're members of it. My point is that this is in the nature of international mechanisms. They never satisfy everyone. Each country has to balance pros and cons and come to a conclusion as to whether being in the agreement is better than being out of it. And I think the NPT speaks for itself. Nowadays, it is almost universal. But its universality wasn't to be assumed. In the early days, it was rather slow getting acceptance. Australia itself took some time. In 1970, I think it was 1970 when we signed, we were still really quite uneasy about it and put a statement in on signature, which had quite a number of very interesting caveats, which we subsequently withdrew 10 years later, I think it was. But anyway, the caveats were there. And it wasn't until January 1973 when the Whitlam government threw aside all the hedging that Australia had been doing about its nuclear weapons ambitions, and we signed up. And since then, though, we've been pretty good members. Gradually over the 80s, membership increased, but the real success story was in the 1990s when you had South Africa declaring its weapons and having them destroyed and joining the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, when Argentina, who'd been sort of playing little games in South America, came on board, and as did China and France. It took them quite a long time to come on board. And then you had the breakup of the Soviet Union with several new countries, of which Ukraine and Belarus had nuclear weapons. They gave up their nuclear weapons and joined the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. So it was a highly successful period in the life of the NPT, crowned by the 1995 Review Conference and Extension Conference, which agreed to an indefinite extension of the life of the treaty. The treaty provided for extension of indefinite extension or further extensions after 25 years of a specific period. Anyway, the option that the majority of states, and it was a vote to be taken by a majority of states, a very simple and in multilateral world, a very unusual provision. Anyway, it was extended indefinitely, and that's the status of the NPT now. The membership is close to universal. The only holdouts were, and still are, India, Pakistan, and Israel. So all new states that have joined the United Nations since 1970 have joined the NPT, with the sole exception of South Sudan. But we can probably forgive South Sudan; it may have other preoccupations. Of course, some countries have unsuccessfully tried to cheat, or maybe they successfully cheated, but they didn't get away with it. And Iraq, Syria, Libya come to mind. Probably Iran, and there are others you could think of that probably were in that technically in breach at various points in time. But only one, DPRK, has used the trigger in Article 10 of the NPT for claiming extreme threat to national security, opting out of the treaty and successfully acquiring nuclear weapons. So I would argue the NPT has performed extremely well, particularly in fulfilling its non-proliferation mandate, but it has also performed particularly well in a second pillar. There are three pillars: the non-proliferation, second is peaceful uses, and third, disarmament, or you can have it the other way around, doesn't matter. But the peaceful uses pillar is equally well served by the NPT. We don't have time to go into that tonight, but there is a lot that's being done in the name of the NPT through the International Atomic Energy Agency in terms of peaceful uses of nuclear energy. But where the NPT has really run into difficulties and failed to deliver in any convincing manner, of course, is on the question of nuclear disarmament. Successive NPT review conferences demanded nuclear weapon states take action on their obligation to negotiate in good faith on nuclear disarmament at an early date. Well, stocks of nuclear weapons globally, or in particular between Russia and America, have fallen from a peak of 60 to 70,000 to current levels of about 12,000. So in a sense, great things have been achieved. But there is a strong expectation that these numbers can be brought down considerably before total elimination. And there's strong sentiment for a whole range of other measures that could be taken to reduce nuclear risks globally. I'll come back to those other practical measures shortly. Now let's turn to the current status of the NPT. The 10th five-yearly NPT review conference was due to be held last year, deferred because of COVID. There's now all sorts of toing and froing about when it will be held. The best guess probably is in early 2022. It's all very complicated, but not really very important in the bigger scheme of things. But the delay, that we might say, is fortunate. The Biden victory certainly brings hope for saner policies in Washington. The extension of the New START treaty, the treaty on capping numbers between Moscow and Washington, being one important initiative or extension of one important arrangement. And yesterday's summit in Geneva also gives us some promise that at least Moscow and Washington are aware that the NPT does deserve, well, the nuclear issues deserve attention, and that by itself will be significant in improving the prospects of a good environment at an NPT review. A final observation on the NPT, and it goes back to one I made earlier about the negotiation of the NPT. No, it doesn't. No, sorry, forget that. The final observation on the NPT. While the absence of progress on disarmament is the main source of friction between NPT parties, it is not the only source of difficulty at NPT review meetings. It comes back to the very nature of multilateral institutions. The very value attached by most countries to the NPT provides a lever for the promotion of additional other issues. So the 2015 review conference failed to adopt a final report, not because of the disarmament issues, but because of Middle East issues. Specifically, the demand of a number of countries in the Middle East that there be a process to establish a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. In summary, an overwhelming majority of countries continue to assess that their interests are best served by the NPT. There will always be tensions in a forum with near universal membership as states jostle for advantage. That is perfectly normal. But it is also clear that the nuclear weapon states do need to do more on disarmament. Now let's turn to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the Ban Treaty. It has its roots in the frustrations about the failure of the nuclear armed states to meet their NPT disarmament commitments. The 2010 NPT Review Conference underlined the catastrophic humanitarian aspects of any use of nuclear weapons. This was followed by a series of international conferences focusing on the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. Meetings were hosted by Norway, Mexico, and Austria, and they were strongly supported by non-governmental organizations such as the Australian-born and now Nobel Prize-winning International Campaign Against the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, ICAN. These efforts culminated in 2017 with a 4-week negotiation of the Ban Treaty. 124 states out of approximately 200 states members of the United Nations, so it wasn't a particularly good uptake. 124 states participated. Missing were all the nuclear armed states and nearly all the allies, those states under nuclear umbrellas. The treaty opened for signature in September 2017, with the required 50 ratifications achieved. It entered into force January this year. And the Ban Treaty will have its first meeting of states party in Vienna in January 2022. At the moment, it looks like it's going to be scheduled at the same time as the NPT Review Conference, but that clearly is not going to happen. That scheduling in the UN system at the moment is nothing short of chaotic. So what will the Ban Treaty do? Well, look, my short answer is, regrettably, despite all the hype, not much. The one reasonable hope is to put additional moral pressure on the nuclear armed states. But sadly, what has the nuclear armed states' reaction been to the treaty? Just the opposite, to reassert the vital role they see nuclear weapons having in preserving global and regional stability. Now, some other comments about the Ban Treaty and what its claims, or the claims of its advocates. For example, they draw parallels with the bans on chemical and biological weapons and say, now we've finally covered all the WMDs. We did chemical, we did biological, and now we've done nuclear. There's only one big difference. The chemical and the biological actually included countries with chemical and biological weapons and actually got them to get rid of their stocks. Not one nuclear weapon possessing state has been involved in this negotiation, and not one has indicated any interest in participating in the process. So it is highly unlikely that this treaty will ever see the end of one nuclear weapon. A second point, the proponents of the ban treaty say that the treaty has now made nuclear weapons illegal. Well, I'm not a lawyer, but every lawyer tells me that this is really not quite the case. Unless the country is bound by the treaty, they're not illegal. So they're only illegal for those countries that have bought into the treaty, as no nuclear weapon possessing state is buying into the treaty. For them, these weapons are not illegal. So that's troubling and possibly even misleading if people think, actually, problem solved, we've got a treaty, they're banned, aren't they? No, well, they're not. There's also a practical issue, I think, that the ban treaty could divert resources from practical disarmament steps, including the maintenance of the NPT regime. It's arguable. On the other hand, the ban treaty does expressly affirm the NPT as the cornerstone of global efforts, nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So members of the ban treaty are committed to upholding the NPT for what it's done and what it will do. Now, how are we off for time? Well, I'll skip that bit. So what is Australia's position? Australia acknowledged the humanitarian arguments and participated in part of the humanitarian processes, but it did not participate in the ban treaty negotiation, and nor did, as I've explained, the great majority of other states in our sort of position. To my mind, if we had participated, as the Dutch did, it would have been a hiding to nothing. The Dutch did participate. I think it must have been very painful for them. And at the end of the day, they were the one country that voted against the text that was adopted. There are 124 states participating. One voted against, the Netherlands, and Singapore abstained. Now, Australia's position would have been, I think, as an umbrella state, invidious to have been part of the treaty process. And to my mind, treaty support is incompatible with our ANZUS alliance, not with our ANZUS alliance, with our status as an umbrella state. I don't think, I doubt if you could argue that the ANZUS treaty itself precludes our membership, but our other aspects of our alliance relationship probably do. So that was the government's position, and that's pretty clear cut. The ALP, on the other hand, is in a bit of a muddle. Initially, Shadow Foreign Minister Penny Wong was clear in saying that the treaty was probably incompatible with Australia's alliance relationship and not to be supported. But that position, which appeared in the first draft of the last ALP platform, was changed at the conference, and the treaty now says that we will sign up subject to certain conditions. And these conditions were summarised when Labour leader Anthony Albanese welcomed the entry into force of the treaty earlier this year. He said, ALP is committed to ratifying, but only after taking account, first, the need to ensure an effective verification and enforcement architecture, second, interaction of the treaty with the NPT, and third, achieving universal support. So my guess is, despite the ambition of joining the treaty, it will be some time off, as in never. So let me now move to the last element of my remarks, the outlook for nuclear disarmament. So where are we to look for a movement? I think, no surprise from my earlier remarks, that the ban treaty does not offer a realistic framework for advancing the nuclear disarmament goal, though hopefully the ban treaty will be a constant reminder to the nuclear weapon states, even an irritation to the nuclear states. Nor does the UN system offer a realistic framework. The Committee on Disarmament has basically been moribund for the last 25 years. Its last achievement, which was a great achievement, was the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, but that was back in 1995. Now they can't even agree an agenda of work, yet alone any substantive progress. The alternative touted by Australia and others is for a step-by-step or building block approach. Now, it sounds good, and in a way, it is a policy I think which should be endorsed. The only problem is that the various steps, and let me go through some of them: deeper cuts, bringing the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty into force, a treaty to end the production of weapons and usable materials, HEU and plutonium, legally binding negative security assurances, positive security assurances, legally binding no first use commitments, all these wonderful ideas, but they've all been on the table for 25 years or longer, and they're all going nowhere. So the advocates of the step-by-step approach are really in a bind also, because they can't demonstrate any measure of success. Meanwhile, the Trump administration, as we'll all know, trashed several measures that once limited nuclear superpower rivalry: the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement, and the Open Skies Treaty. So my conclusion is that we need to start building again. The New Start extension is positive. We need new approaches to the old issues, and we need a new agenda to address the issues of the third nuclear age, arising from cyber threats, space-based systems, and advanced non-nuclear weapon systems. But the big question is how to make things happen. If history is any guide, the most likely trigger to wake us from sleepwalking into nuclear disaster is shock treatment. It's sort of another Cuban Missile Crisis would really do the world a good deal. And a reminder of how, the nuclear missiles crisis shows how fear can be a real motivator. And we might well find it happening again, particularly in Asia Pacific, where there's daily games going on between nuclear armed elements in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But short of that, there's a lot that could be done if there was the political will. And here are 5 areas I think that we need to think about. First is keeping nuclear disarmament on the highest level agendas, both globally and regionally. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's difficult in these times of COVID and climate change. And the G7 meeting in Cornwall produced a 25-page long communique, which referred to Iran and DPRK, and that was it. There was nothing on nuclear issues whatsoever. No mention of the NPT, no nothing. At the G7, President Biden referred to climate change as the existential issue. Nuclear disappeared. Well, until last night, and Biden and Putin have put it back on the agenda, so we have something to be grateful for. But Australia, as a way forward for Australia and like-minded countries, clearly we need to make greater efforts to keep nuclear issues at a high-level profile internationally, globally, and regionally. And that requires resources, that requires foreign ministries to be empowered to actually do stuff, not just in Australia, where ours has been, since I last worked in the department on these issues 25 years ago, cut by half the resources devoted to nuclear issues. And I suspect that's what's been happening in other foreign ministries around the globe. Certainly the State Department was decimated under the Trump years, and they're going to have real troubles now putting together a team to re-engage with Russia. So resources, it's not cheap, needs to be done. The second point, we need to find champions. And, you can look elsewhere, but it really has to come from the top, and it really has to come from Russia and the US. And you can look at the sad cases of Obama. He had a wonderful start with his 2009 Prague speech, and then got a Nobel Peace Prize, and then it all fizzled. It all fizzled in the face of domestic realities and real-world complications. President Biden has made a nice start with New Start, and with last night's communique. Last night's communique, by the way, is very curious. It goes back to the Reagan-Gorbachev statements of 1987 that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Now, that's nice to have that reaffirmed by Biden and Putin. And it was nice that they did it. I think it was in the same palace where Gorbachev and Putin met, where Gorbachev and Reagan met in '87, the same palace in Geneva. Maybe wrong about that. Biden has not yet promised a grand vision, and looking at the Obama experience, maybe it's a good thing he hasn't. Other possible champions, well, one can look. One once looked at the UK, but March this year, I think they've just walked back from any leadership role on this by announcing they're going to increase the number of nuclear weapons, which is some efforts being made in the UK to say that this is illegal because it's against their NPT commitments. I don't think that will work either. But we do have to look for champions. The third point I would say is that we have to maintain the focus on the NPT as the cornerstone, for the reasons I've already outlined. A fourth point for Australia, as risks grow in our region, we need to make a greater use of the regional security machinery to encourage confidence building measures and other ways of dealing with clarifying, exploring, documenting nuclear threats in our region. And we probably need to have new mechanisms, just as like we have a new mechanism for trying to negotiate a code of conduct in the South China Sea, just as we had a new mechanism to try and negotiate the six-party talks for negotiating a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. In any of these scenarios, we'd have to be looking to China. We'd also have to be looking to Japan and Korea. China is not going to be a willing leader in this. They've said time and again that the problem is not theirs, look to Moscow and Washington. But I think we have to make efforts to engage China regionally. And I think we have to do more with ASEAN. ASEAN and its structures, including the East Asia Summit. ASEAN offers partnerships which can bring balance and moral force to the case for the reduction of regional nuclear threats. A fifth and last point, we need to refresh, rethink, and modernize the old agenda. The stepping stones approach is still the best on offer, but we need to rethink the whole process. A final plug, these rethinking and renewing efforts can be helped by academia and advocacy groups. One that I've been involved in, the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, is an Asia-Pacific-based network inspired by Gareth Evans' work on the Nuclear Commission, the ICNID. And I'm commending you to its website, where there's a brave effort to have Asian voices speaking to Asian issues on nuclear issues. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John, for a very comprehensive talk. There's a lot of meat there for questions, I think. Does anybody want to start the ball rolling? Yeah, Richard. And if you could speak up and say your name. Speak into the microphone for us. Thank you.
Richard Matthews, John. We used to work together on nuclear issues. I lasted 2 years, 2014 and 2015, in ISD and DFAT. I congratulate you for lasting so long as you have on this issue, because I found it to be an issue that I thought would never be resolved. Nuclear weapons seem to be it's one of those wicked problems which no one's come up with a solution for so far. I attended the second and third international conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in Nayarit in Mexico, and then in Austria in Vienna. And I must say, at the time, the enthusiasm amongst all the participants was tangible. You know, they thought this was the great new thing. And on reflection, perhaps it was, because there's been nothing else. You know, at the time, and it then led to the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. You know, all these young people and NGOs thought they were out on a mission to save the world. And I can understand that, because, as you said, there's been no ideas for, what, 25 years or something? All these new step-by-step ideas have been on the table forever. You know, we still haven't seen the ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, but it still manages to function. So I just wondered, my question is about the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty. Do you think its function might actually end up being a bit like the NPT, in that it helps to bind signatories to it and contribute towards non-proliferation in the long run? Or is it, you know, is there no point to it whatsoever? I mean, can you see any positives in this Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty? You know, those that have signed on to it are also members of the NPT.
Exactly.
You know, they're recommitting themselves to non-proliferation. So in some future conflict or some future state of affairs, you think it would have a positive impact in preventing proliferation?
Well, thank you for the question. And indeed, it was great times working together on these things. I guess the Cuban Missile Crisis next year is important to me personally, because that's when I first became aware of nuclear matters and was very touched by the world events and became and been an interest ever since. Look, the ban treaty, I mean, it could, as I said in my remarks, I think, help to remind nuclear weapon states and be a bit of an irritant to them. So in that sense, it's not all bad. There is this point about draining effort from more productive things, but the problem is to find the more productive things to get the focus onto. The ban treaty does a few things which the NPT doesn't. It prohibits stationing and It also has obligations about cleaning up test sites and whatever else, of some possible use to some countries, I guess. But yes, as a further commitment on non-proliferation, it really is not particularly helpful. And the one thing that the safeguards Ayatollahs go on about is the treaty didn't even make the additional protocol to IAEA safeguards, you know, the gold standard of this new treaty. Additional protocol, of course, is what we now want everybody to have, and there was an option that could have been argued in the ban treaty negotiation to have that standard set, but it wasn't going to go because the half a dozen countries that are holding out against the additional protocol, and they weren't going to allow themselves to be steamrolled into that in this negotiation. So it hasn't raised safeguards or verification standards. It will just be the same, exactly the same as what they're now required to do. What are they going to do when they meet for the 2 or 3 days in January next year? I don't know. I mean, there's certain obligations where they can talk about. They're meant to be going out and propagating membership. Well, of course, every treaty, in a sense, requires its members to go out and advocate for it. It has got a requirement in the treaty itself that the first meeting of states parties will examine mechanisms which nuclear weapon possessing states will need to, the actions they will need to take and the timetable in which they'll need to take those actions once they join the treaty. So the treaty doesn't actually spell that stuff out. That's left for later. So they could spend a lot of time discussing how nuclear armed states should disarm. But I do think that would be a waste of a lot of expensive diplomatic resources. And if they came up with some bright ideas about disarmament verification, good. They're always welcome. But yeah, I think, frankly, there's very little they're going to achieve apart from being the irritant to the nuclear weapon states. So good on them for that.
Okay. All right, we've got a couple of questions. Yelena first.
Елена Zabortseva, thank you very much for your valuable insights and addressing so important issue. I've got two questions if possible. First, how is there and how serious do you think might be the threat from non-state actors to nuclear weaponry in our era of cybersecurity? And second, you've mentioned that following collapse of the USSR, Belarus and Ukraine were considered as having nuclear threat, but not Kazakhstan. Is it because you've just mentioned those two countries as examples, or because Kazakhstan's nuclear threat wasn't considered as serious as the one from Belarus and Ukraine? Thank you very much.
Non-state actors was your first point.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes, I mean, of course, there's been, particularly since 9/11, a whole range of activities sparked by the thought of nuclear-armed non-state actors. And some good work done against nuclear sabotage and a range of mechanisms have been established to try and enhance nuclear security, the main thing being nuclear security, how to protect from terrorist activity, protect nuclear installations from terrorist activity, and how to ensure that nuclear materials don't fall into the hands of non-state actors. So in the last 20 years, there's been a great deal of work done in tightening up all these areas of control over nuclear activities globally. Of the three states, Belarus and Ukraine, I think, were the ones that had the weapons. And would have, I think, under the Soviet arrangement and the breakup arrangements, had an option to retain the weapons. I'm not sure that, my memory, and maybe completely false, my memory was Kazakhstan didn't have, it did. Okay, I'm wrong. And Kazakhstan.
Oh, okay.
And Kazakhstan.
I thought maybe it wasn't considered serious or...
No, it was my failed memory.
Okay. All right, there's a question over here.
Thanks. I'm Sue Wareham from ICANN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. John, thanks very much for your talk, and particularly for highlighting nuclear weapons as one of the existential threats, which has been lost a bit of focus compared to climate change, but we regard both of those as threats to all of us. On the TPNW, which, as you know, ICANN was prominent in promoting, you referred to the moral pressure that the TPNW creates, and yet seem to imply that that doesn't mean much. And yet I think part of the reason for the strong pushback from the nuclear armed states against the treaty is because they know that that moral pressure matters and it means a lot, and that the treaty therefore is not a toothless tiger. From the point of, in relation to Australia's position, surely if Australia wants to preach disarmament and non-proliferation to other nations, then the first thing that we need to do is get our own house in order and practice what we preach and state that we do not want to be protected by these weapons ourselves. So for as long as Australia continues with the line that these weapons are essential for our security, then it's ridiculous to think that we can persuade others that they should not have these weapons if we believe that we need them for our security. So perhaps a response to that the very best thing that Australia could do would be to say no to extended nuclear deterrence. And we would not agree agree with you that this is a threat to the alliance. A number of nations in our region have strong military relationships with the United States. For example, New Zealand, Thailand, Philippines, they're all party to this treaty, and yet they maintain a military relationship with the United States. Just on the NPT, you mentioned countries that have, the small number of countries that have cheated on the NPT, which is of course a concern. We would agree with you that the NPT needs to be promoted still. We don't agree that it's the cornerstone of our efforts because the TPNW, I think, is overtaking that. But the NPT is still very important. Certainly agree with that. I think one of the things that we can do in relation to the NPT is to highlight the fact that the P5 also have cheated on the NPT. They have not fulfilled their obligations. And when the NPT has its 5-yearly review, I think that can be an important focus that the countries with the weapons have undertaken to get rid of them, and they have cheated on that obligation. And final comment, the steps that you put forward as possible measures that Australia and others could take, no problem with any of those, and I don't think there's any incompatibility between the TPNW and the other important steps that you outlined, such as seeking champions, working with ASEAN and other measures. They're all completely compatible with the TPNW. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sue. And look, I mean, the question of the position of New Zealand, Thailand, and Philippines. Yes, I mean, if the Manila Treaty is still in force, and so they're technically covered by that. But the point I've made, I think, in the talk was that I don't think it's the ANZUS treaty as such that causes an incompatibility. It's with that provision of the ban treaty which says it's the provision which says that we can't you should not encourage or whatever a state to threaten to use nuclear weapons. And obviously, if we're in our situation, it's not from ANZUS that comes; it's from our assertion that there is a nuclear umbrella protecting us that would be incompatible with the treaty. Now, if we get rid of the alliance, that's another matter. But I'm not here to discuss that tonight. If Australia wants to abandon the umbrella, it may be a good way to go, as you say, to help reduce global reliance on nuclear weapons or the threat thereof.
What we're arguing is that if Australia needs a nuclear umbrella, why should, for example, Iran not need one, or why should North Korea not need one if Australia needs one?
Yeah, I know the arguments, but I think that's a bit beyond tonight's discussion. But let me go to the point on the ban treaty and the relation to the NPT. You said that it overtakes the NPT. I don't think that is quite right, and particularly if you look at the preamble part of the ban treaty, it says, reaffirming also the full and effective implementation of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation Nuclear Weapons serves as the cornerstone of the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime.
Yes, indeed. The TPNW fully upholds the NPT as it should. What I meant in my comment was that in terms of what's going to have an impact on whether we achieve disarmament or not, many people would believe that the TPNW is becoming a very important instrument in that respect, whereas the NPT, after 50 years, has not got rid of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, look, I hear what you say. I just have a different view.
All right. Well, we might move on and take a couple of questions from the online audience. And we've been talking about alliance obligations, John, and Peter Hooton's asked, what does a nuclear umbrella buy us when the United States can't protect itself from nuclear attack? And what has Australia to fear from nuclear weapons other than as the ally of a nuclear weapon state?
Thank you, Peter, for that unexpected question. Yeah, look, I mean, I'm not here to defend the alliance or the nuclear umbrella. I think the problem is that in Australian politics at the moment, the chance of moving away from the umbrella or the claim of the umbrella, the logic of the umbrella, I agree with Peter, is very hard to understand, and it's all smoke and mirrors to my mind also. But and its relevance to our security is not at all clear. But politically, both sides of politics are committed to it, and I don't see in the short term that that's going to change. Now, my focus has been on, okay, we deal with that fact, and then what can we do to advance the agenda? Some might say it's a waste of time. If we don't change on that, there's not much to be achieved. No, I don't think that's quite right. I think there's things that can be achieved, short of a radical shift in Australia's 75-year-old security stance.
All right, there's a question here about whether Australia could use influence as a uranium exporter to pressure others to ratify the CTBT.
Well, look, I'm hoping I hope we do. Now, of course, this does raise a very interesting question, because way back when I first got involved officially in nuclear matters was on the conditions of export of our uranium. And of course, as some may remember, this was a highly charged issue, and it was all Labor Party politics. That was what it was about. We had an ALP conference here in the Lakeside Hotel in 1982, was it, 83? When the party was grappling with how it was going to deal with uranium exports. Officials were called into the back rooms of the conference, can you believe, to advise how they could write the policy so that we could sell uranium, but still be a global leader on the disarmament scene. And that was basically the trade-off within the Labor Party was, yeah, okay, begrudgingly, we'll agree to exporting of uranium, but only if we go out there banners and waving and really do something on the international scene. Well, it was a good time for the disarmament lobby, because we were funded and we had a lot of opportunity to engage globally, and Australia became quite a champion at that time. And you know, it led up to things like our lead role in the CTBT and Chemical Weapons Convention, for that matter. But the basic compact was, we flog uranium, but we put the most stringent of expectations on the controls on its use, and we be a leading advocate for nuclear arms control and other arms control measures. So I'm hoping that perhaps today, getting back to the Labor Party's muddle on the ban treaty, that should there ever be a change of government, that the Labor Party would find itself in the same sort of positions it was in the early 80s, to explain why it's not buying into the ban treaty. It's going to have to up the efforts made on other aspects of arms control, nuclear arms control, and perhaps we have a new time where Australia can regain a bit of its leadership in reducing nuclear risks.
All right. James, from the back, thanks.
Thank you. James Wise. John, you haven't lost any of your grasp of these issues in the 35 years since you and I worked together on these issues in DFAT. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. You mentioned that China, just briefly, but left me with the impression that China's prepared to sort of take a back seat, if you like, and say, as you mentioned, look, it's up to the Americans and the Russians. Notwithstanding that, do you have any information on the Chinese nuclear weapons program in terms of number? Is it growing? And in terms of technological capability, are they improving them? Also, within the context of China and the concerns that are emerging about China as a potential security threat, within the context of mutually assured destruction, there's some commentators looking at the possibility of some sort of war in the future with China take some comfort in this concept of mutually assured destruction, that it would be a break on some possible ambitions of a country like China. I'd be grateful for any comments you might have on that.
Thank you, James. Always a perceptive question.
Always ask the hard ones.
Look, I haven't been following the Chinese position very closely, but I do understand that they are steadily increasing their nuclear stockpile, nuclear weapons stockpile. And of course, they're probably less gradually increasing their capacity to deliver at a distance. And I think that's where we start to enter into some very complex areas of nuclear strategy, which the region really hasn't come to grapple with yet. But it gets back to some of the fundamental things. Why did the Americans pull away from the ABM treaty? Because the deal which was struck between Washington and Moscow to only protect the capitals and sort of limited areas with ABMs becomes harder to explain when you've got threats coming from other sources. With China being one obvious source, and now with the DPRK demonstrating it could reach mainland United States, these calculations become increasingly complex. And I'm not quite sure if it's going to your question, but it does go to the point, I think, that the dynamics of all this going on in the Asia-Pacific region are not really well teased out, not really well understood. There's no forum in which they can be discussed. The US traditionally had this center and wheel and spokes approach to strategic management. So they had separate agreements with Japan, China, deals with Taiwan, deals with Australia, and they're all managed separately. And there is very little in the public domain about what any of these arrangements mean in practical terms. I did some probing on what it means for Australia, what not the ANZUS Treaty means, but what the nuclear umbrella means. And I can't find much evidence of any depth to that policy at all, beyond the fact that we believe that the umbrella exists. How it might be activated, if there's any discussions about this, I don't know. I put it out there. If anybody knows about them, please, I'd love to hear. And so I think that's the basic problem that we have in the region, that China is obviously going to continue to grow probably at a faster rather than a moderate pace. And so all these relationships are going to be changing, and we don't have mechanisms for managing them.
We've got time for one last question, Desmond, if you could make it brief, thanks. Okay.
Thank you. Desmond Woods, Councillor, ACT Branch, AIIA. One thing we haven't mentioned so far, and John, I'd like your thoughts on it, is the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime. Whenever you bring up the subject of nuclear deterrence, and particularly unilateral disarmament, which is what the ban treaty is advocating, you have to consider that unless you have an absolute verification regime, which means that no one is cheating, you would never know whether that intercontinental ballistic missile in the air is conventionally or nuclear armed. In other words, whether it's going to take out 10,000 people or 1 million people. And until someone can show how a missile technology control regime could be enacted and enforced, The other side of it, nuclear disarmament, looks to me like a two-legged stool, because no one is ever going to get rid of that last weapon while they believe that someone has the capacity to strike them with a nuclear weapon. Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's indeed, yes, a good question to end with, isn't it? Well, I don't think the MTCR is where we look for the answer to this. Of course, the MTCR is a missile proliferation regime, but and has had some benefit in containing the spread of ballistic missile technology. But your question, I think, goes to the business about what is the third nuclear age, and it gets very much to this question. With these new range of new types of missiles, and we'll never know whether they're nuclear tipped or not. And I think we've already reached that point where that's the issue. The INF, intermediate nuclear range, nuclear, anyway, it was about nuclear threats, but it was about the technology of the missiles. So it didn't matter what they were carrying, they were banned because you couldn't tell whether they were carrying them or not carrying them. So the assumption would have to be, unless there was some other way of knowing, the assumption would have to be when an incoming missile is spotted, the radar is not going to tell you whether it's got. Sure. No. So that's in part, I think, why a lot of the US-Russia agreements have been about missile numbers. There are also, I think, limits on warheads that can be carried, but it's generally been about missile numbers, and that is the assumption being that the missiles will carry nukes.
And multiple independently targetable re-entry.
In some cases,
missiles.
that.
So you're not
indeed.
dealing with a missile with a warhead.
Correct.
That's old school.
Correct. So yes, I mean, as we go down to zero, there's going to be massive stuff to be done in terms of delivery systems, intrusive verification. I mean, I think a lot of the thinking's been done, but by no means enough thinking has been done to get a degree of comfort between any of the nuclear states that no, there's a lot of work yet to be done.
Well, I think that's a very good place to leave the conversation as well. John, you provide us a very informative, thought-provoking discussion. I'm not sure we've reached any firm conclusions, but at least we know a little bit more about the issues. It's always great to hear from our long-standing members, and we thank you very much for coming and presenting tonight for us. Ladies and gentlemen. Like I say, our next meeting will be in July, and we will have a presentation from Professor Anthony Milner from the ANU on Australia's role in promoting a new international order. So that should be a humdinger. I look forward to seeing you on the 14th of July. Thank you.